Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. For years, there have been cries for changes in various state curricula. Parents and teachers alike have clamored for more rigorous content matter that creates critical thinkers rather than regurgitating automatons. Alongside these crusaders are an equally, if not more so, vocal group who would caution what our students are learning in school and why. It is this vocal minority that has led the recent and not so recent drives to have certain books taken out of our schools, fearing that our youth are becoming indoctrinated with a particular ideology. Enter the College Board, the company behind the Advanced Placement Program, a program that many families rely upon to help reduce the cost and time students spend for college. In fact, the College Board prides itself on being able to offer college-level coursework to high school students with the intent of preparing them for the rigors of college by creating critical thinkers. They beg the question, how do you create critical thinkers when you limit the resources that will challenge student thinking? Today, we welcome Ileana Najarro, a staff writer for Education Week who has covered race and opportunity issues in schools across the country. She has also covered this issue of curricular censorship in her recent article, College Board Warns Against Censoring Its AP Courses. Ms. Najarro, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you for having me.
Can you please define what the problem is that the College Board is warning us against?
So first, let me provide a little bit of context for why we even wrote this article.
Sure.
So back in January, I had reached out to a College Board to ask about whether there were any concerns that legislation that had been passing at that time and continues to be introduced and passed today, limiting how discussions of topics like race and sex and gender are discussed in K-12 classrooms, do those efforts have anything to do or have any possible impact on AP level courses? And the reason we wanted to know that was because College Board sets standards for all of its AP courses. Now, while a student in one AP class in one city versus another might learn the topic in different ways based on what their teacher thinks is the best method to approach that topic, the topics are the same. It's sort of the closest that you have to sort of national standards, right, for this particular coursework. So I wanted to know, okay, if this is the one thing that can go across the board, but let's say you're in Texas where you have a law that was HB 3979 limiting how you talk about current events, is that class going to change compared to a class in California taking the same AP course? Back then, the response from College Board was that they weren't aware of any situation where state requirements would conflict with AP course standards. But then now we're up to, I think, at least 15 states that have some form of a ban in place, either through legislation or other means. College Board sent out to all AP instructors a reminder of its AP program principles. And what's really interesting is that when you look at these principles, which again, they're not newly crafted, these have always been in place, but timing wise, right, you see a reminder suddenly go out. They talk about all of the ways that AP courses, what they're trying to accomplish, which many of the principles that they list actually sort of are in conversation with some of the legislative text. But then one key point that we focused in on for the story was the reminder that if you censor topics in an AP course, you could be subject to removal of AP credit for that course. Every year, College Board undergoes an auditing of its course program. So say you're a school in Long Island and you want to offer an AP course next year, you need to get all of your syllabus vetted by College Board, usually through college professors that work with the institution, right? They confirm that you are covering all of the required topics for that course, so you're good to go. If, say, you were going to teach AP Bio, but you decided that you're not going to talk about evolution, because your school has decided that is too controversial. Well, during that audit process, you would be told, okay, you can go ahead and teach bio without evolution, but you don't get to call it an AP course. The students who take that course will not be able to get that credit. But now let's say you got the approval for AP biology, but then at some point in the school year, the teacher decided, you know what, evolution is too controversial. We're not going to talk about it. Well, then parents, students, or even educators can contact College Board through their course audit helpline, notify them that, hey, one of the required topics that you listed online, we're being told we can't learn it or we can't teach it. Suddenly, that course is no longer an AP course, and that AP designation on a student's transcript would also be removed. So that would be sort of a direct consequence to students, right, because of a censoring of a required topic. Now, some folks can take that as here's College Board taking a stand against any form of legislation that would say you can't talk about certain topics. But here's another reminder from College Board. They do not tell teachers how to teach these required topics. So for instance, in AP US history, they can say you have to talk about cause and effect of the US and its allies' victory in World War II. Which leaders are you going to talk about in class? Which battles are you going to choose to review? And are you going to have students read primary documents? Are you going to have a historian come in to talk about that? Those more nitty-gritty instructional process, College Board is not getting involved in that. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of these bans and these laws are really getting more at the how question, less so the what. So on the one hand, you have College Board making a very strong reminder of opposing censorship. But they're also talking about opposing indoctrination, and they're not diving in to the question of how do teachers go about talking about required topics that can, at some point, maybe come into conflict with this legislation, depending on how the teacher talks about it.
It seems that in creating these laws and these policies that these states are doing under the guise of protecting our children from indoctrination, it seems like that's exactly what they're doing, right? Because they're prescribing a particular way that they're going to be taught and that they're going to learn the material. So how do we, and I don't know if you can answer this, but how do we therefore create a world of empathy if people aren't exposed to varying viewpoints?
Well, that's an interesting terminology there of the varying viewpoints, right? Because AP principals, for instance, they note that AP students are expected to analyze different perspectives from their own, and you don't get any special points if you agree with a certain viewpoint. These laws are kind of getting at that same. So for instance, Texas HB 3979 says, if you're talking about a current event or a currently controversial issue, you have to give contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. Right? So some of these laws are worded in a way that they're saying, yeah, we got to get everybody's voice involved. But they're also saying, but you have to, like, for instance, Florida HB 7 says, but make sure that you don't have students feeling guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress because of the past action done by members of their same race or their national origin, et cetera. And so I think especially when we heard from teachers trying to navigate, so what can I do? What can I not do under these new laws? And I'm trying to also teach AP courses. What do I do? There seems to be more questions from educators around something that many history teachers do, which is connecting the past to the present. Because on the one hand, some of these laws even outright say you have to talk about slavery. You have to talk about something like the Jim Crow laws. But then if you are teaching that course material in your class, are you allowed to connect and say, oh, something from the present is the legacy of Jim Crow laws? That's where it gets a little bit more nebulous of sort of the connections between past and present, that for a lot of educators is one tool to get students to be critical thinkers because it makes them feel a little bit more engaged with the material, right? Because you can see, oh, the reason I'm learning about the past is because this is how I can better understand the present. And I think there's still a lot of confusion there over how to go about those connections and whether or not these laws can get in the way of that.
I was a history teacher myself. And one of the biggest questions that I had to answer from students was, and it was in middle school students, mind you, but still the biggest question was, why do we have to learn about dead people? Why are we learning about things that happened in the past? Well, I always made those connections between past and using the lens of the present. So these are the things that are happening now. These are the things that happened back then. You see the parallels. And I forgot who it was who said it, but it was, we have to learn from our past or else we're doomed to repeat it. So that's kind of what's happening. So we talk about Jim Crow laws. So it kind of makes the logical jump, therefore, to talk about things like Black Lives Matter movement, because why is that a thing? Because the laws during this time don't seem to be in favor of Black people in this country, just as Jim Crow laws were not in favor of Black people in the country during that time. So there's those parallels. So how do we reconcile that, or can we reconcile that?
I think that's where, and you bring up a good point that teachers that we've talked to at EdWeek, myself and other colleagues, can share that oftentimes when teachers are trying to make these connections between the past and present, it's exactly because of what you said. Students are the ones asking, why do we need to know about this? Hey, does this have anything to do with that? Like, they're the ones that are curious. And there is sort of this chilling effect that is being reported on, of teachers saying, well, now I don't know if I want to engage in that conversation because it might be misconstrued, or it might, somebody might take it that I'm trying to make a point about something when I'm just trying to present the facts. And what's also interesting is that even if you just stick to talking about the past, and in particular talking about moments in American history, let's just focus on that, because you can even go into deeper of world history and all of this. When you're focusing on American history and you're focusing on moments like the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? That we had one AP teacher talk to us about how her students are always shocked whenever they learn about that, because in their mind, from what they had understood up to that point in class, that wasn't a thing that would have happened in the US. And they're trying to grapple with that. And I think teachers are not wanting to avoid these topics completely because they can see the value in their students questioning, well, why was that in place? What was the goal of this? And where are we now? Because it helps them better understand that, it helps them better contextualize the present and have a deeper understanding of the country and where it's come from since then as well. Like, I think there's sometimes this concern of, if you talk about all these dark moments of history, you're somehow telling kids to hate the country, right? That you're somehow indoctrinating them to be anti-patriotic. When what we've heard from teachers is that, if anything, when they do delve into the subject matter, students get even more, or become more patriotic or more interested in sort of seeing, okay, so this is where we started, this is where we're at, this is where we still need to go. And it gets them excited about learning.
From what you just said, it seems as students actually become more patriotic because they understand, this is where we were, this is where we've come, how far we've come. So they actually feel more in love with their country because they see the growth that has taken place, and they want to be a part of that. And they know that, we're a country of humans, and we evolve over time. So seeing the country evolve gives them hope that there's hope for everybody else at the same time. We also know that Florida, for instance, has just signed now into legislation that's Don't Say Gay bill. Explain to our listeners, if you can, what that is, because I think you gave the actual bill number before, what that is, and if there are other proposed legislation from other states that you have seen popping up. I know you mentioned the one in Texas as well. Is there any other bills similar to that are popping up around the country?
So this is where I am going to plug in Education Week. And I recommend folks who want to track this legislation and sort of track where similar legislative efforts are popping up. We do have a tracker on our website that sort of gives you and even provides the links to the legislation itself, because I think it is important to read, the actual text and see what it does say and what it doesn't say, right? I think we call it Map Where Critical Race Theory is Under Attack. So and the reason we have that headline is because much of this legislation is under the sort of umbrella term of anti-critical race theory. You can debate on whether or not, that is a thing in K-12 and why do we call it that. But so for instance, HB 7 isn't particularly the Don't Say Gay bill, which is, I believe, the parents' rights bill, but a lot of these anti-CRT legislation that is focusing on what you're supposed to talk about in the classroom, how to not be anti-patriotic, et cetera, they do tackle issues of sexism, of sexual identity, and all of that as well. It's all interwoven into all of these questions of identity, really. And if you even see, oftentimes when you're looking at this legislation, you'll see the term divisive concepts come up a lot in this legislation. And those divisive concepts have to do with identifiers, whether it is your sexual orientation, your gender, your race, your national origin, et cetera. The way that this is written is that you're trying to make sure that teachers are not pitting one group against the other. They're not trying to invoke any form of discrimination against students. A lot of educators will tell you that they already don't do any of that. But there's that question of when you're talking about the past, when you're talking about what one group was involved in the past and what another group experienced in the past as a result, that's where I think things get a little bit muddled. And so you can follow our tracker as we are noting whenever these bills are introduced, whenever they officially pass, look at the wording to see. I think for the Don't Say Gay bill, which is sort of how the popular headlines call it, one of my colleagues wrote a great explainer in terms of what it actually covers, which is passing around the same time as we know that the anti-woke bill, which is the HB7 one, is being passed. And I think it's good to be able to see that it prohibits sort of the instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity for students in kindergarten through third grade, right? And it's very much focused on those grades and what you can actually talk about, with a lot of questions from LGBTQ plus families saying, well, are we allowed to say a student in the classroom talks about how they have two moms or two dads, and is that going to become an issue when you're talking about that in the classroom? So it's, again, whether you're focusing on something like the Don't Say Gay bill, whether you're focusing on the anti-woke bill or any of these other forms of legislation, it comes down more to classroom instruction level of how teachers can engage in the more current event and present day context situation, where you're not necessarily banning instruction of the past, but you are sort of saying how you're supposed to talk about the past in an age appropriate way is the term that is used a lot in some of these efforts. And then you have the question, right, for others saying, oh, talking about systemic racism at a young age might be too much, age inappropriate. You have the opposing side saying, well, for students of color, they are well-versed in racism. Whether or not they want to be, they are well-versed in it from a very young age. So what about their needs and the questions that they have? How are teachers going to be able to address that?
What is that website again where people can go to find out some of this information, especially that legislative tracker?
So edweek.org, we have, we cover K-12 education, everything from policy to what's going on inside the classroom. And if you look up our CRT map, you'll be able to see we regularly update that as more legislation is introduced. And a reminder that some of this isn't even legislation. For instance, we even note how in Virginia, it's an executive order from the governor that is looking into whether or not schools are teaching divisive concepts and critical race theory, et cetera. So I recommend folks follow that because they'll be able to sort of see in real time and be able to read the legislation themselves to see what's going on. And that's where you'll also notice how a lot of this terminology is actually the same across state lines, whether it is in a budget proposal, whether it's its own bill, et cetera. And I think that's why in my article on the College Board, we put side by side some of the sample text of this legislation with text from the AP principles. So you can see how they're kind of speaking to each other. The Florida one, for instance, saying, don't make students feel bad about what their ancestors did. AP principles very clearly saying, students aren't supposed to feel any certain way about anything that they learn. So I think it's fascinating when you actually look at the text side by side.
Right. And I was looking at that. I was going to ask you about that as well, that when you look at the text of the two side by side, it seems like you said, they are speaking the same language, just maybe a different dialect. But it's the question that I have, though, is how do you prevent somebody from feeling a particular way? I mean, because I think as a teacher, when you get your students to feel a particular way about the content that they're studying, that's what you go for. That's your goal, right? Not that you're teaching them you want them to feel this way, but if they are so swayed by the information because they've thought it through themselves and they've come to that, they drew that conclusion themselves. That's what, as a teacher, that's the holy grail, right? That's what we want students to be. So how now are we being penalized for having our students get to that point, even though they came to that point on their own?
So some might argue that the legislation is sort of protecting teachers from that, in the sense that it's saying specifically, you shouldn't tell a student, feel bad about this or feel good about that, right? It's saying don't tell them how to feel. But you bring up the point that if a student feels a certain way and they feel very powerful about one way or the other, or something that was discussed in class, could that be misconstrued by school administration as, well, I think the teacher was making me feel that way, right? And I think that's where teachers have a lot of questions of, okay, so yes, I'm not going to tell the student, and you need to feel bad about what your ancestor did. But if the student ends up feeling that way, is that crossing a line there, right? Do you have control over that, right? And I think that's why there's a lot of vagueness to some of this legislation that is causing some confusion. Now, teachers that we've spoken to have, in general, said that they're going to continue to teach their AP, in particular AP courses here. They're going to continue to teach it the way that they always have, right? In part because they have a track record of getting students to successfully pass the test and be able to get their college credits. So they see the academic success in the way that they've been teaching it. So they don't necessarily feel the inclination to suddenly change it. But it is interesting that even one of the lead U.S. history teachers in the country, Michelle Marr in Miami, who has been teaching this for years now and has had a great success with her students in the course, she even felt the need to ask her principal, wait, so I'm good, right? so this law that's trying to pass and all this conversation, do I have to worry about that? Because she herself has said that she's never had a student come up to her to say, your class made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to know about the past that way, right? Instead, she's heard the opposite, as we talked about earlier, of students feeling even more patriotic and more impressed of the ebbs and flows of U.S. history that they were able to learn in this class.
What Ms. Marr does, and I think what any good history teacher will do, is, you look at those primary and secondary source documents. And let them kind of speak for themselves and let the students interpret them for themselves, as opposed to you telling them how to interpret those things. And that's what I think teachers are confused about and afraid of, that they're not going to be able to kind of teach or develop critical thinking by just kind of, okay, here's the document and now you come to your own conclusion. So I think there's that kind of sense going on there. But let me ask you this. I know we talked a little bit about the impact that it may have on AP coursework going forward and how things are going to may change or may not change. But how do we think that this may impact how teachers actually are viewed? Because I know they're audited at the end of the year or at the beginning of the year to see how closely they've stuck. And College Board actually has to approve those teachers to teach the AP coursework, correct?
Yeah, they approve the syllabus that's going to be used, right, to make sure that you're actually checking off all of the topics that were required for that specific AP course. And in some cases, not all, even the required text, for instance, AP US Government and Politics does require certain foundational texts that need to be read. How much of it you have the students read, at what point in the school year, that's up to the teacher, but they just need to see that, okay, you are going to assign this at some point.
How do we therefore prevent these like dystopian societies that we have seen in books like Brave New World and The Giver, and even a couple of books that are on the banned list or the proposed banned list that people are coming up with? How do we prevent things like those types of societies from happening, where we're kind of dictating what students are going to be taught.
Well, I will say that especially when it comes to book bans across the country, you are also seeing, and this goes to your point at the very beginning of this conversation, that there might be a group of parents and politicians who are trying to pass these bans, trying to pass these laws that are trying to restrict how certain conversations are led in a classroom. But on the other side, you also have families and students that are pushing against this, that are actually asking for more equity initiatives in schools, that are asking for these books to be reinstated and to be fully taught in the course. And to AP's point, the College Board is sending that reminder that if you are really trying to tamp down and say you cannot read Letter from a Birmingham Jail in US government and politics because your school is concerned about what Dr. King says about the moderate white man and you don't want to touch it, but you still somehow want to get AP credit, that's not how it's going to work. We set that as a required topic and a foundational text for students to read and study. So either you teach it with AP credit or you lose that. And families, as you mentioned earlier as well, would really like to have that AP credit because it can help you complete college on time or even in less time, which means saving a lot of money. And there's been a push as well to get more students access to advanced placement courses. Again, as you see the news and you follow our tracker of more bills and more efforts introduced, know that that means there are also families out there that are vocally pushing against this, going to their school board meetings and trying to figure out how to make sure that all students' needs are being met in the school, that they are developing critical thinkers, and that they are allowing for a wide variety of texts and lived experiences to be part of the academic space in school, whether that is gay, straight, Black, white, whichever part of the identity spectrum that you want to choose from. And I want to make a reminder as well that the timing of all this is even more fascinating by the fact that this coming school year in the fall, there are going to be about 60 schools that are going to be piloting College Board's first AP African American Studies program. That in of itself is going to be very fascinating to see how that course is going to interact, if at all, with this legislation, because here you have a college level course for high school students that is talking about a variety of subject matters, from history to psychology to economy, but from a very specific racial lens. And how that is going to interact with laws that are saying you can't put one race above the other, you got to be careful with how you talk about different group interactions. That's going to be fascinating to see down the line of how this course that has been in the works for many, many years, right? And is continuing to be fine-tuned and assessed and evaluated to see how it could work, what is included, et cetera. That would be really interesting to see how that plays out down the line.
You've given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of different things to think about, especially that new African-American course sponsored by College Board for AP Credit. We would definitely like to thank our guest today, Ileana Najarro, staff writer for Education Week, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you for having me.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.